Right, so we left off looking at this map here and seeing what the Roman Empire entailed. So we're going to a little more details. Here's the picture of the deified uh, um, Roman ruler, right? Okay, so again, we have an outline of these dynasties that were important. Um, and now we'll talk a little bit about the centers of power. So one, the city was important. And we'll talk more about that later, also in contrast to cities versus the rural areas. And I think it's fair to say that this is always the case, right? You need people to grow food, so people in agriculture are very important, maybe super important. But the problem for people in agriculture is that they tend to be tied to the land. And if you have people not forced to stay there for various sets of reasons, then nothing, like, you're gonna have famines, right? So you tend to have more conservative people who are locked down to the land and who are not going to be exposed to a lot of very different things. And you're going to have a kind of disdain by the city people, looking at them as backwards, um, uncivilized, and lower. And at the same time, people out in the country feeling that the people of the city are very arrogant and having values that do not represent theirs. So that there's a lot of those little contrasts you're going to see between peasant world and urban centers. Okay, and I'm just to say, like, when you look in this on even nowadays on one level, and then especially during these times, and we'll talk more about that as well. Now, just to kind of clarify also about the way that the power works, something that I think that we tend to forget, and it's important, is even now when we look at, like, let's say the leader of North Korea, or we look at one of the presidents of Iran, and they represent this power structure that, for those of us in the West, look at as totalitarian. The assumption then sort of becomes that the current leader of North Korea literally has all this power in his hands, or that the person representing the Islamic Republic of Iran has all the power in his hands. And I mean, let's just think about this. No matter who you are, if you command the military can always turn on you. The military has all the weapons. And I don't care how tough you are. Obviously, it does not take many people in the military to take apart anyone ruling in the name of a given country. So armies are significant always in nation states, in that if it's rather a person having direct rule and power, rather it's a king, some sort of a people's republic ruling person, a president, a senate, I don't care what the nature of it is, if the military does not acknowledge a chain of command and sort of acquiesce to that center of power, then they can take over. The military has the state power because they have the weapons and the military command. So the leader has to have actual control of the military to have control at all. And so in the case of the Senate here, we saw in Imperial Rome, they pretty much were acting as administrators as opposed to any kind of positions of their power. They didn't really have much power, but they were in the service of the center of power. And it was the Roman army that really gave the power to the emperor. And, again, just to remind you, when you look at military coups, the United States government decided we didn't like a president in Chile. I've mentioned this before, and we had a backdoor deal with a military general to get rid of any kind of socialist communist ideas there, and we supported having their president killed and the military taking direct control of Chile in the 70s. The, and the military has often intervened in many of Latin American countries when they saw fit. Turkey has had that issue of the military intervening in their democracy. So again, this legacy of a ruler and the army and what it means, you should think about. And we in America, we presume that the army would never do such a thing, that the army is subservient to the commander in chief, even when you hate the president. The military can hate Obama or they can hate Bush, but he is their commander in chief. And you don't generally hear about the military wanting to revolt, but it can always happen. So that stability that we have, which we take for granted, is something that I think that many times during the Roman imperial rule, there was the same kind of thing took for granted, that the military understood their loyalty was to Caesar. And so that's important. And then later on, when that breaks down, and that can always break down, that's when you start to see a certain type of an end to politics as you know it, right? We can always have the military take over. No president's going to be able to stop that, or the Congress or Senate. But it's beyond our comprehension at this point in history, right? Okay. So the army obviously became super fundamental for the Romans, because the army is what helped it make an empire. And as we look in this chapter here, the significance, I mean, if you're looking on 176, legionaries enlisted for 20 years of active service and 5 on reserve. I mean, think about how, some of you and my students now and in the past have been in or are members of the military. And, thinking about some of these extended tours that Americans have had to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan seem to be controversial or problematic to many people inside the military and out. But imagine having to serve in military campaigns actively for 20 years. Now, some people choose to do that, but here this is the way it would go, right? So we talk about a very militarized society. And we're talking about really skilled military who this is what they do. And there were rewards, right, offered to veterans, but most didn't live long enough to get those rewards. Now, what's kind of interesting is there's a lot of theories on this. It's not talked about as much, I think, in this chapter. But eventually we're going to talk about the fall of Rome. And this is the point where it gets debatable. They would use auxiliary soldiers from the non-Roman territories that were considered barbarian. And eventually they could receive Roman citizenship. Now, what it meant is that the Roman military was becoming more and more non-Roman, but it was Romanizing non-Roman people. And this is really, I hope, can really help you visualize the slow process of creating modern Europe, where these illiterate Germanic, Celtic, Slavic-speaking peoples that are out on the periphery are going to come in contact with an organized state that has a written language, a literary tradition, and a hierarchical consistent hierarchical setup, okay, and is going to start Romanizing these peoples. And this is how we're going to get languages later in the future: French, German, Spanish. We're going to have these Romanized languages that are specific to these areas. And we're going to see the impact it's going to have on them. Simultaneously, there's no way for Rome not to be influenced in the other way, right? By these peoples that they're looking down on, but you're incorporating them into your empire. And so this is going to kind of haunt Rome fairly or unfairly, the situation of where they're bringing in all of these outsiders into the into the Roman world, and it's going to become a little bit problematic for the empire. So you have this, and then we have also controversial emperors like Nero. Nero is infamous in Christianity for reasons we'll talk about more later. He's a persecutor of Christians. And as you saw in the British Isles, he also was controversial. He's controversial as also just being a very cruel person. But in the case of the British, the Iceni people in the British Isles were Celtic groups that did resist Rome. And in 61, BC, there was a female, Boadicea, who's a very celebrated, powerful female warrior who was known for leading them, the Iceni rebellion. Her daughters were raped, and she saw a lot of things that made her angry. She was very successful at first, but ultimately she took her own life as she saw the failure of her rebellion. And the Britons learned, as the textbook says, that resistance against Rome was futile. And I want you to remember this also when we go to what happens to the Jews. The Romans had a style that if you resisted them, they made you pay for it, and everybody knew about it. Okay, we'll end right here.